Assalamualaikum and very good day to our lecturer Dr. Abdul Razak bin Aziz and my fellow friends. Today, our group will be discussing and elaborating on the topic of smells, tastes, and everyday aesthetics by Emily Brady. Our group consists of three members, who is Nur Ain Nabila binti Azmi, one Ariff bin Wan Muhammad, and me myself, Muhammad Jufri bin Ismail. Move on to our first slide, which is an introduction. Introduction. In this section, we will elaborate and discuss precisely the definition of smell, taste, and everyday aesthetics and their relationship. First thing first, the definition of smells. Smells is physically defined in the nose by receptors combined with the olfactory nerve. Smell has a dominant position by this physical criteria because our sensation of what comes into the mouth is also perceived through olfactory receptors. In addition, the nose is usually considered to be a more sensitive receptor than the tongue, so most of the work is done by smell in everything. The process of generating the perception of smell is olfaction, or sense of smell. Olfaction occurs when olfactory receptors located in the nasal cavity bind odorant to specific sites. Smell is the sense that involves sniffing or breathing through the nose. Secondly, is the definition of taste. Taste is physically interpreted in the tongue by receptors, or taste buds. The sense of taste is the feeding, drinking, and smelling through the mouth include savoring. The sensory system which is partly responsible for taste sensing is the gustatory system, or sense of taste. Human beings have taste receptors on taste buds as well as other regions such as the upper tongue surface and the epiglottis. Other considerations include scent, detected by the nose olfactory epithelium, texture, detected by combination of mechanoreceptors, muscle nerve, and etc. Then, the temperature detected by the thermoreceptors and coolness, such as menthol and etc. Next is the definition of everyday aesthetic. Alexander Baumgarten founded aesthetic as a discipline and described it in his seminal work Aesthetical Aesthetica Cognition Sensitive, the Science of Sensory Awareness. Nevertheless, theorists such as David Bess, Wolfgang Welf, and Lev Kraft propose that the idea of art be extended literally to non-artistic practices through a metaphysical context connected to daily aesthetics to consider sports as an art form. Feminist aestheticians often promote the use of other senses, such as taste and scent, that can make aesthetic sensation in everyday life beyond the two conventional sight and sound. Korsmeyer, Kenneth, and Glenn support the inclusion of food among artifacts and interactions that are aesthetically important. Orthodox aesthetic theorists claim that aesthetic experience requires an instant awareness of meaning, but also a reflective or contemplative attribute associated with reflection and creativity. If an aesthetic entity should not be temporary, it is impossible to understand how natural ecosystem can possibly be properly considered in this view. Therefore, the critique of aesthetic objects relies on a narrow notion of the nature and plurality of aesthetic objects. Last but not least, there is the relationship of smell, taste, and everyday aesthetics. The prevailing definition is for most human eyesight, so it is not shocking that visual characteristics have traditionally gained the most consideration in aesthetics. Of course, emphasis on visual quality is not a negative thing, because in certain circumstances, these qualities may be the most critical attribute of an artistic product. For example, recent work in environmental aesthetics has aimed to transfer focus away from the strictly visual and scenic to enjoyment guided by the variety of senses. Other arguments support the connection of taste and smell with the body, that taste and smell lack the mental dimension considered necessary for aesthetic appreciation.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Nabila. So I will present for the next slide, which is on observation and discussion. So in this article, we found there is a few objections that has been stated by the author, which is the author was said that a few objections has been raised against these two sense that most of the criticism came from a traditional approach to aesthetic judgment and response, exemplified by Kant aesthetic theory. So the first one is smell and taste has been classed as lower pleasure and has been neglected to the realm and the crude because their association with the body and non-human animals. This prejudice from because of the distinction that has been made from the long philosophical between lower and higher pleasure. It is stated that the higher pleasure is associated with the mind and the intellect. As for the lower pleasure, it is associated with the body, include eating, smelling, sense, and other bodily functions such as sweating. And the next one is smell and taste also had a little role in history of art compared to sight, as there is a dominant sense. Some philosophers also argue that sense of smell and taste cannot be disinterested because they think that smell and taste belong to pleasure. This is associated with them very closely with consumption and desire. She also stated that when applied to aesthetic appreciation, disinterestedness stipulates contemplation of the aesthetic qualities of an object for their own sake rather than for any interest it might represent. Also, Kant stated on his second objection that smell and taste are lack of mental component considered vital to aesthetic appreciation. The traditional aesthetic theorists argue that aesthetic experience involve immediate sense perception, prominently reflective or contemplative factor associated with thought and imagination. Also, Kant contend that taste and smell belong to the realm of the agreeable. Kant stated that there must have form or structure in order to have an aesthetic judgment on the object. If smell and taste are lack of the structure, they can never be included in the category of aesthetic object. So the next objection stated by Kant is the smell and taste are subject of an individual rather than intersubjective linking. This claim is commonly held belief that view that we are more likely to question or seek justification for a judgment of a work art. The last objection stated by Kant was the claim The smell and taste are not easily specificable as aesthetic objects. Smelling and taste are considered more unreliable and contemporary sensation compared to the sensory experience of sight, touch, and hearing. So for our discussion, we found that the author was object the criticism that has been mentioned before in the previous slide. So she aimed to show that these two signs constitute aesthetic objects that generally fall within specialized consumer type appreciation and aesthetic response in everyday life. The author was argued that these two signs can meet the objection that has been mentioned by the philosopher, which is the criticism of this approach on its own term. For the first objection is about the lower pleasure. She said that in Western culture, many cultures dictate that simple pleasure are smell and taste. Smelling salt, for example, is considered unseemly possibly because our activity is similar to non-human species, which is another reason is presumably that taking interest in bad smell is unseemly. In addition, they cover natural odor with perfume scents such as sweat. Criticism of excessive eating and drinking is another norm that encourages vigority even when raised to an intellectual art or science that blends smelling and tasting with detail and refined knowledge. So the next objection for these two scents found in the artwork as smell and taste have had a little role in history of art compared to sight. There is a dominant sense. But the author was stated that it is possible to find olfactory description in literature, and many writers regularly use smell and taste description. She said that many contemporary artwork have made progress by using various scents and organic materials to draw on our sense of smell, which is, for example, soy, vegetable, blood, chocolate, milk, and so on. So there are also several artists who use food as well as edible art to design all kinds of items. So the next object and the next objection that she object from the philosopher about smell and taste, which is smell and taste are lack of mental component considered vital to aesthetic appreciation. So the author object by said that we find single and mixed smell and taste particular and generic ones, and we can discriminate the different strands of mixed and complex smell and taste. So the study of art of appreciation itself will find more evidence of the complexity and structure of the smell and taste. The best example being in this concept of olfactory and gustatory connoisseurship. For example, as illustrated by the description of cheddar from Guide to Cheese, which is the flavor start off fairly mild and middle sweet with nutty tones, often with a light salty tang. It's mature to strong, full, wonderful nutty taste with a real piquancy to do it. So this is the complexity in the smell and taste. Furthermore, the objection of smell and taste are the subject of an individual rather than intersubjective liking. We might like the required critical vocabulary that allows for the argument in the case of smell and taste, but it is easier to formulate justification to engage in critical debate when there is careful focus and other critical skills are exercised and sharpened. In comprehensive food and drink criticism, evidence for this can be found. For example, we may be interested in reflection by enjoying the taste of a particular form of ice cream, which is we focus on the taste, making association as we try to approximate where the characteristic of the taste fit with other experience and whether it is good or unpleasant. When we categorize the taste of vanilla ice cream as smooth, silky and mellow, we draw that on the notion of smoothness or maybe equate this aesthetic quality with another artifact. So the last objection by Kant, which is he claimed that the smell and taste are not easily specificable as aesthetic object. In an instant, smell come and go, and often we cannot connect them to some single source easily. This leave our plate shortly after eating food. So the author was the objection with the example, which is the richness of our knowledge of nature is significantly related to its temporary consistence, such as change in weather and light, season, the effect of growth and decay, and beginning of the end of bird song, moving animal and leaf in a shortened time frame. So she stated that the aesthetic object criticism therefore rests on a limited notion of the character and diversity to the aesthetic object.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Ariff. So I will discuss about and present about the article critics. Okay, through the journey of the author about the smell, taste, and everyday aesthetics article, Brady has so much point to identify why does the aesthetics can be relating toward the food in the term of smell and taste. Okay, she has mentioned about how the smell can be more sensitive than taste. Particular smell and taste are particular to certain food. The smell of the food comes first. That can create olfactory memory based on the past experience rather than the taste, which is the contact of the food toward the mouth is the only way for the people to know about the food, whether it is considered as pleasant or unpleasant experience. And also she also argued in how that the aesthetician claimed the food is not considered as aesthetics value. She gave one example as a connoisseur, which is the one that have been a judge of the food and the expertise in how the food tastes like and how they describe the food itself. It shows that the appreciation toward the food make the people know how to describe the food itself in the term of a vocabulary, for example, such as delicious, okay, velvety, or something like very hard to pronounce, but for the connoisseur, they pronounce the food based on the characteristic of the food itself. All right, thank you. Okay, so now for the issue that happened in the articles, the author addressed the issue that happen nowadays in a very good way. So for every single claim by the other aesthetician and a very long lost philosophical in how the food cannot be related to the aesthetic value is so brilliant. So she describes based on the previous study by the other researchers about the aesthetic aspects and structure that needed to describe some things. Okay, and then the judge of the aesthetic object must be structure like color and music, and then considering the structure of the food itself, it can be described based on their color and also texture, and then it can be included in the aesthetic aspect. Right, and then the aesthetic structure also come from the olfactory, which is a nose, and also gustatory experience, yeah, normally based on the mouth lah. And then the description of the food is based on the structure of the food itself. Besides that, okay, the enjoyment of the food is described based on the contemplation and past experience to compare the taste. And smell and the taste create imagination and evoke image and association. The final objection by the author toward the past claim is smell and taste cannot be specifying as aesthetic object. Okay, she compared the experience of the object of the aesthetic can be temporary, same as food. When people consume the food, for example, okay, it is become temporary experience because they no longer feel or experience the food after consuming it. Alright, and the author wanted to relate for every claim made to ensure that the point that she made is related to the claim itself. In contribution of study, okay, based on that related to this article, the author, okay, mentioned in the last paragraph of the article is to encourage the people to experiencing the journey of aesthetic moment in the food. So based on the appreciation toward the food is based on the aesthetic aspect that help the people to value the food itself. She also mentioned on how people appreciate the food by becoming more sensitive toward the food aesthetically and build more vocabulary in how to describe the food that they consume and so on. And in addition, it opened a new opportunity for other researchers also to study more about the aesthetic value in food in the term of smell and taste. Even some paragraph has been discussed about how sight can be considered in appropriate aspect of life and not really relating into aesthetic value of life. Other researchers can gain more data to ensure that how the sight can be one of the important aspects to be discussed that related into aesthetic aspect in food. The popular food quote "eat with eyes" okay is well known for people, especially in the food presenter like chef or connoisseur that appreciate how the food is presented to attract people to see the food first before consume it. Based on the gap and inconsistency that can be seen in the article is based on how the author defended the claim that has been made by the traditional philosophers. The point has been made to ensure that the claim is being defended but not entirely show every point is really being discussed in this article. For example, okay, the author mentioned about how sight can be dominant point in showing the aesthetic value of object, but okay, when relating to how food can be related to as aesthetic object based on the side point of view, there are not so much to be discussed too. Maybe the reason is the author want to give an open point of view so that this point can be further studied and to be discussed more. Besides that, okay, the author had mentioned that the smell and the taste is undeniable to be against lower and higher pleasure object. The argument cannot be made due to the theory of aesthetic itself can be confirmed to claim that the sight, the smell, and taste can be considered to be inappropriate aspect of life, but not really the aesthetic value of life. In this article also, the lower pressure can be described in eating, sex, or sweating aspect, while the higher pleasure can be related to mind and also intellectual aspect. How can food itself to be considered the value of aesthetic aspect is still under discussion through this article. Okay, so now for the last slide, we will discuss about the closing statement. From the review evaluated the article, Smell, Taste, and Everyday Aesthetic by Emily Brady. Throughout this crucial in the article that has been discussed by the author, there appears to be no standardized methodology or procedures for her defense in all the claims that have been made by traditional philosopher. Through this discussion, she had mentioned all the claims from the philosopher regarding about the title to be discussed for to show that how smell and taste can be and be must be related to everyday aesthetic. Appreciation of smell and taste must be looked outside the point of view of existing aesthetic aspect. Smell and taste also need to be looking in environment perspective to show how they can relate into everyday aesthetics. Besides that, approaching the flavor combination in food considered as aesthetic quality that comes together with experience. And so on, the experience that involve attention toward combining two flavors to create new kind of flavor is considered to be one of the aesthetic value because only by experiencing from the people itself can ever think to do that. Okay, in addition, combining of experience and aesthetic can create great satisfaction and pleasure as the same feeling that people feel when relating into art and music. Last but not least, the author has been made a lot of points to convince people that read this article on how smell and taste can be related to aesthetic value, but still left 1 or 2 points that can be discussed to the other researchers. Nevertheless, it stands only at the beginning of more detailed research to come. Thank you.